Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's Agile London. Great to see some of you back again, and some new faces as well. We've had a really large amount of interest in this week's event, and I'm sure this will absolutely live up to expectations. Just a couple of house rules, if I may. Most of you, I must sound like a broken record to some of you now, but it's just worth me reminding some of the newbies. If I could ask that you kindly just stay on mute throughout the whole session. And if I could also ask, and I really do actively encourage questions to all three of our speakers, but if I could request that you are quite specific and clear with your question and who you wish to ask it for, and then you just write it in the chat at the bottom of your screen, send it privately to me, and I will sort of MC the questions at the end and ask them to all three of our speakers or them individually. The reason I do this, obviously, if we're all on mute, there's no noise interruptions. And obviously with the questions at the end, it just really helps with the fluidity of the event. So the speakers can answer your questions clearly and they get their opportunity to do so. And everyone gets to hear their answers. So, as I say, thank you for joining us tonight. Three great speakers. We've got Darryl Bucksey, who is an Agile and Product Coach at And Digital. His talk is How Relevant Will the Agile Principles Be Post-Lockdown? We've then got Amy Thompson, who is Head Coach for Retail and Community Banking at Lloyds Banking Group. Her talk is Storytime, the Grown-Up Approach to Sprint Planning. And to finish us off for the evening, we've got Stuart Corrigan, who is Head of Agile Delivery with Lloyds Banking Group. His talk is Fragile and how to make your Agile project deliver. So, Darryl, you are up first. Can I just get you to share your screen?
Yep.
Your audio is good, and I will just let you know when we can see your visuals in full. Yep, all looks good. So, Darryl, over to you.
Cool. So, hi everyone. So today, or tonight, sorry, I should say, I'm going to talk to you about how relevant the Agile principles are going to be, post-lockdown. So first of all, just a bit about myself. So I'm a product Agile coach for And Digital. Been at And Digital for about 3 years. Background of product, historically. Been an Agile coach for almost 2 years now. As I say, my background's sort of product ownership and product in general. Been around long enough to worked in both Agile and waterfall teams. So, good experience as far as that's concerned. And I guess for me, I'm, passionate about sort of making sure teams are working on the right product at the right time. So without sort of further ado, let's kick off. So, we've been in some sort of lockdown now for 4 months. So who'd have envisaged this, at Christmas? It's such a unique sort of and crazy situation. And, we don't really know what's going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months, let alone a year. But, we know there's going to be change. So how do we adapt? What do we need to do? From where we work to how we work, we'll need to flex and adapt accordingly. But how are we going to do this? Well, I think, first of all, we need to go back to look at, understand what good looks like for ourselves and for our peers and our teams. So with this in mind, sorry, I've realised that my Slack is not turned off, so apologies. I might just pause, just do that. Sorry. Apologies, everyone can still see my screen? Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Cool, sorry about that. So, it's been 20 years since the manifesto and the principles came about, but even before COVID, there were a lot of confusion. People didn't really understand it, or they found it complicated, they didn't understand it, they didn't get it, and we see people saying Agile and Scrum are the same thing. They're the same thing, they're no different, And I was one of these, sort of 10, sort of 12 years ago. I first started looking at Agile and Scrum. It was the same thing to me. We then have people that are, multiple certifications. That means they're the experts. They know exactly what they're doing. There's no problems. We've got this. We've got these certifications, so we know exactly what we're doing. And then we've got teams that, they think that actually we're doing Agile, we're doing the Scrum events, we're doing stand-ups, we're doing sprint reviews, we're writing user stories, thinking about the processes rather than the actual sort of mindset and the principles. But how hard could it be? For me, there's four values and 12 principles. It can't be that complicated, not when it just comes down to that. But my concern is if people found Agile complicated, confusing prior to lockdown, then what has this 4 months been about? What have they been doing in that time when they've been working from home, completely remote? And what's it going to be like as we move back into some sort of normality where people actually go back into the office? How hard is that going to be, and how relevant will the principles be then? So in this session, I'm going to look at some of the principles that I feel probably can be deemed less relevant, not irrelevant, notice, just less relevant. Then I'll touch on a few which I think teams need to be really mindful of going forward with this new sort of world. And then just to finish off, just some ideas and some principles or some values of what I think is important, and teams should be aware of going forward. So firstly, let's take a look at what I think are, a couple of the least relevant principles post-lockdown. And to begin with, I'm going to just concentrate on this one. The most efficient, effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. Now, we know that, even though the principles have been around 20 years, technology has changed. And actually over that, during that time, it's meant that, is this as important as what it was? Where does it say anywhere that face-to-face conversation has to actually be in the same room together? Over the last 4 months, teams have had to work remote. There's been no choice. So, they've taken advantage of what is, that technology that's improved. I mean, who didn't wish they had shares in Zoom from 4 months ago? We know that face-to-face conversation is important still. There's no doubt about that. Things don't get lost. You can see people's reactions, their body language. You can see how they react to stuff. But actually, that's the thing with the technology and with the improvement in technology, it doesn't actually need to be in the same room together. That face-to-face conversation can happen over Zoom, Google Meets, MS Teams. Any of those tools will actually allow you to do the same thing as what that face-to-face conversation can be. And we've seen that actually, teams can still work remotely and still produce the same outcomes. I've got teams that I work with that said they've been more efficient and more predictable over the last 4 months. Why is that? Well, basically because, they haven't had to have as many meetings. They haven't got as distracted as much. They've been able to flow better and understand, what they're trying to achieve and be able to achieve that. It shows that you don't need to be in the same room. And obviously, along with that, there are challenges, We know that there's cultural differences, there can be time zone differences, but actually, as well as that, with the sort of the extra benefits of working from home, or that sort of flexibility, that has actually meant that teams can produce as much. And actually, with the right tools and with the right training, we know there's no difference. I've seen that for myself. So with these benefits, with this flexibility, with this tooling, and with the fact that the manifesto doesn't state you need to be face-to-face in the same room, then I would definitely suggest this is one principle that we can, is not as relevant post-lockdown. So what about the other principle I've chosen? The next one is working software is the primary measure of progress. The primary measure of progress. How can that be the case? What about value? Surely we want to move towards outcome-driven rather than outputs. And working software initiates that output-driven approach rather than the outcome-driven approach. But what is value? How do you measure it? Well, I think that's, depends on the domain, the team, but that's not something I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. That's probably a talk within itself. But why does this principle sort of affect teams post-lockdown more than it did prior to lockdown? Well, I think for me, that companies obviously have less budget now. It's more of a competitive market. Companies have less money to spend on projects and products. They have less money to spend on people, So they need to make sure they're getting the highest value, the bang for their buck as such. So, by choosing the right outcomes, or understanding that you move towards a more outcome-driven approach, you spend your money on the right things at the right time. And this can be, the value of financial value, or it can be, NPS scores, customer feedback. So if companies and teams are thinking more about sort of value rather than working software being the primary measure of progress, then, I think they're going to survive, they'll thrive. However, if they're still working towards that moving towards that working software piece, I think they're going to struggle. We need to be more aware of the outcome, that value piece. And if we do that, then we'll continue to grow as a business. So they're the two that I think are most relevant. Sorry, the ones that are least relevant, apologies. But what are the most relevant? Which two do I think are actually you should be aware of post-lockdown? So firstly, that inspect and adapt mindset, about your regular intervals, you're inspecting, you're adapting, you're adjusting your behavior. We know that, teams absolutely should be constantly reflecting on what they're doing and trying to improve. If they're not, they're standing still. The market's going to be a lot more competitive going forward. So, how can we do this? Why aren't we doing it more? Why do we talk about retrospectives being the only time when you inspect and adapt? What stops us inspecting and adapting all the times? I mean, self-reflection and inspecting and adapting is something that in life you try and do, you're mindful of, and it really does transfer into an agile organisation. If you're not inspecting and adapting, as I say, you're standing still. So, listening to the customer, understanding the customer, and taking on board that qualitative and quantitative research, don't just use one, use both. Understand it, let it help you make those decisions. Let yourself as teams sort of grow into that. Nowhere in the manifesto does it say it should just be a retro for feedback. Nowhere. So why don't we encourage it more? Why do we wait for that retro piece? Be more mindful of it. Be totally aware of it. Use the time where you can. Use the feedback where you can. It will help you as a team to grow, to have that continuous improvement mindset. It will be, mindful for teams to understand what's happening in the world as well. And it can be a gateway. The retro is a gateway for improvement, but it's not the only one. If you empower the team, you can help them drive decision making. You can encourage that mindset, and hopefully with that you can create a more psychological safe environment which allows your teams to experiment, to see teams become closer, more efficient, and give you that competitive advantage, which is what you need in that competitive world going forward. The second principle that I've chosen is around architects and self-architects' requirements and designs emerge from self-organising teams. Now, self-organising teams have always been important. There's no doubt about that. It's not just that it's important now. If they're not autonomous and empowered, then, and it's top-down approach, then you're not going to be successful. I've not seen it myself where teams are successful if they're not self-organising. So, what do we do? We've seen over the last few months that actually, due to the fact we've all been remote, there's the possibility that teams and managers have had to be a bit more hands-on. And there perhaps hasn't been quite as much self-organisation. So how do we resolve that? What do we do? Why do we need to be more aware of this going forward? So I think we need to tackle it head on. We need to get back to trusting and empowering the team. There is a possibility that going back to work and going back to the office, not everyone will be back in the office. So it might create mini silos within teams. That can cause issues around decision making and feeling a bit more top down. So we need to try and discuss that, understand what we can do about it. So I go back to the first principle, that inspect and adapt that I spoke about before. You know, we need to be aware of that and tackle it head on. We need to be empowered to have those conversations. We need to get back to discussing why we're not self-organising and trying to resolve that. If we're not self-organising, we're not autonomous, we're not empowered, then I always find that teams aren't delivering the right thing. They don't understand what needs to be delivered. They're told what to do. You know, there is that sort of hippo almost effect of top-down approach. And if they're not delivering the right thing, then the value's not there either, which means you're not successful. Finally, and just the interest of time, I think probably about right, there's just two principles that I want to sort of add to this. And it's hard to think, you know, as I mentioned, that actually teams find it difficult to understand Agile. And I don't want to, you know, make it more sort of tricky for them to understand and bring more sort of constraints to the table. But fundamentally, I think for me, you know, psychologically safe environment, having that psychologically safe environment is vitally important. And it's something I've discussed already tonight, you know, and you could say perhaps doesn't it go into building projects around motivated individuals? Well, maybe you could say that. But I think for me, it's so important, it needs to be called out separately. So what is psychological safety? And, you know, how can we achieve it? Well, it's about, you know, creating an environment where people feel safe, where they can ask questions, where they can push boundaries, where they can show their vulnerabilities, where they don't feel embarrassed to ask questions and to try different things in different ways. You know, it's about learning from your mistakes almost. You know, there's the you know, the phrase about sort of, you know, failing fast. And it's true, but I would also say fail fast to learn fast. You know, there's that slight sort of tangent on that. But how's it achieved? You know, when we see teams with delivery pressures, you know, how do we make sure that we are trying to breed a psychologically safe environment? I think there's a few ways. I think you can start off with small steps by ensuring that, you know, you're collaborating where you can. So if you're doing some work, that you pair. When you're writing documents, that you get feedback as soon as possible. You know, it's about accepting that you know, there is different opinions and yours may not always be the correct one. And it's about understanding and trying to get to the right point. It's about trying to, you know, to make sure that you realize that there's good intent everywhere. So, for example, you know, when we go into retrospectives and by bringing up the prime directive straight away, norm curve prime directive, you know, making sure that people are aware that it's not a, you know, people have made decisions and decided on things with the best intent with what they know at that time. But they're small steps, you know, as we progress and we go forward, you know, take those small steps and run with them. Try to show your own vulnerabilities. You know, if you're not sure of something, ask the question. You know, it's not a bad thing to show that you're not sure about something or you're not clear about something. You know, and from that, then when you can sort of move forward and look at sort of bigger sort of pieces, you know, at the long term, you start looking at the mindset. You know, you try to think about how you can introduce a sort of a more experimental way of working, whether that be something like dual track agile or something similar to that, where you're trying to improve hypotheses as quick as possible and trying to base your decisions based on what you can find out as quickly as possible. As I say, you're learning and fail fast. So that's psychological safety. The other one, just to finish off, is customer feedback. And again, look, you know, customer feedback, it might be a case of saying, well, doesn't that come under welcoming changing requirements late in development? Yeah, perhaps so, and that might just be me, but whenever I think of changing requirements, I think of, you know, people further up the food chain shouting about stuff and getting their own way because of the position they're in. It doesn't necessarily mean for me actually utilising real customer feedback, real customer data, real customer needs. But, you know, by using the right tools, by using the feedback, you know, and understanding the qualitative and the quantitative data, it can help us as help product owners and teams to make the right decisions, to build the right things. If you use just analytics to see for example, where people are dropping off. Is that enough? Does that give you context? I'd probably say no. You need a bit more than that. You need to see their pain points. You need to understand what they're trying to achieve, why they're trying to achieve it. So you could use heat maps, but even that might not be enough. So you might have to go to the crux of the matter and have interviews with them, etc. But using that feedback, using that data is important. It'll help you keep up with competitors, and if you're not using that feedback, how do you really know you're building the right thing and solving a problem for the customer? So invest in the right tools, getting the right people, understanding the feedback. It just allows POs and teams, as I say, to make the right decisions. And it gives you, eventually, I think, if you manage to build that psychologically safe environment, the ability to learn and fail fast by building simple hypotheses and trying to disprove them as quickly as possible. It gives you that feedback loop, which is vital in such a competitive market. So, as I wanted to finish up by saying that actually this evening I've only touched on 4 principles that exist, 4 of the original principles. There are another 8, and I'm not saying those 8 aren't important, because they definitely are. And that's not what I'm trying to say. All I'm trying to say is that in today's sort of competitive world, with so much going on in the unique circumstances that we've got around the world and with your teams, then let's bring it back to basics, and perhaps just let's concentrate on a few less than the 12. As I say, the other 2 that I've introduced or brought to the table today, I think they're important for people's toolboxes, both for teams and for individuals. It's important to understand them. It's important to know them. And I think to compete with today's market and to keep ahead and to be agile, you need to be aware of them. So I think they'll help teams grow, and that's what we want to do. We want to see that growth mindset, not that fixed mindset. So that's my talk for this evening. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully the fact that Slack came up and disturbed me right at the start didn't put me off too much and didn't put you off too much. But what I would say to you is hopefully you've taken away at least one thing. And if you can take that away with you and make a change tomorrow, just that 1% change, both for yourself or for your teams, then that will help you and your teams continue to grow. Thanks for your time and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Darryl. Really enjoyed that one. Do you want to just unshare your screen? Perfect. Thank you very much. Got some good questions in as well, so I will ask them to you at the end. Great stuff. Amy, I've got you there. Do you want to just screen share?
Hello. Yes, I'll do that now. Thank you, Alex.
Audio's good.
Fabulous. It's just sharing now. Give it a moment. Okie doke. So can everybody see my presentation, but not anything else like my speaker's notes or anything?
Yeah, just the presentation. You're good to go.
Fabulous. Okay, I'm going to move you bad boys over here. Okay. So my talk is called Story Time. So a little bit about me, everybody. I have been in this arena for about 10 years now. My previous history is mainly in Agile coaching and Scrum Mastery, and I've worked for a variety of verticals from telcos, such as what was then Orange, is now EE, obviously, Vodafone, a whole host of financial services, leisure like Center Parcs, for example, we all know who they are, right? Translation, manufacturing, Sherwin-Williams was a company that makes everything from Ronseal to the paint on your car. So just goes to show that everybody needs software, right? I love anything to do with horses, and I especially like to have peas with absolutely anything. Who doesn't like peas? Okay. So I'm here to talk about how storytime can be worked within Scrum, and we all should know by now that Scrum is a disciplined framework. Now that might be quite confusing to some of you at the moment, and why I've actually said that, and slightly oxymoronic, but I'm going to explain, that in order for any methodology to be successful, you have to have structure, routine, and discipline to it. Otherwise, all the benefits obviously will not be realized to the intensity that you would hope. Okay, so that's why I'm starting out with this, because this meeting called Storytime that I'm putting into the Scrum framework is to help you with discipline and structure, and actually to be objective driven with your Scrum, rather than just have Scrum ceremonies that tick boxes that might not necessarily work for you in the current format that they are designed to be in at the moment. This meeting called Storytime is something that is designed to help you with those objectives, and I will talk to you about how they work in just a moment. So let's talk about the benefits of this meeting called Storytime that I've introduced, and why I kind of invented it. It's obviously not a formal meeting to do with the Scrum framework, but it's one that I have taken to every single contract I've in post probably about 2006, where everywhere I went, I realized that companies and teams experience the same problems and the same issues with discipline and structure and preparation for sprint planning everywhere I went. So any company that says they're special, they're not special. They all make the same mistakes. So I found that this meeting called Storytime solves a whole host of problems, because in my experience, if sprint planning doesn't go well, sprint execution doesn't go well, sprint delivery doesn't go well, and before you know it, the integrity of the Scrum framework is undermined, and the benefits of the Scrum framework are not realized. Okay, so Storytime is different to backlog refinement, okay, because as we all know, backlog refinement concentrates on not just the next sprint, but a couple of sprints after that as well. Okay, so hence the main difference with Storytime as opposed to backlog refinement is we only are thinking about the stories for the next sprint. Okay, so ultimately, this is about setting each other up for success. And for me, the core of setting each other for success is trying to put yourself in someone else's position in the team and understanding what they need in order for them to be successful. And I find that really good Scrum teams set each other up for success because it's a really good positive driver for good behavior when you're thinking about other people's needs at any given time within the sprint. So let's think together about some of the common gaffes that we experience in sprint planning and sprint execution, okay? So I'm just going to have to come a little bit closer because the writing's quite small on my screen. So first of all, the stories are less clear or thought through than a Donald Trump tweet. We've all been there where we've been in in sprint planning, and we're thinking, this story is pretty terrible. Nobody's thought about it. It's not even realistic. One of the big problems that we've probably all experienced. There's way too much put into the sprint. Again, the thinking hasn't taken place. The logic behind each one of those stories hasn't taken place. Hence, too much goes in. The expectations are too high. That's going to set up your sprint for failure. Stories are put in the sprint that are not ready. So the definition of the definition of ready isn't there. What I like to call sprint fit stories are not there. Hence, again, setting sprints up for failure. The PO doesn't attend, leaving it up to the team to decide what the heck, what does that even mean? You shouldn't be ever asking your Scrum development team to fill in the gaps because the product owner or whoever is responsible for writing the stories has not done their thinking in advance and have left it up to the wrong people. It's not fair. It's not their job. Don't put them in that position. There's not enough time allocated to sprint planning. So for me, it's really important for sprint planning to have both the traditional how and what elements. So we should understand, what and how elements. So we should understand what do we want to achieve in the sprint, and technically, roughly how do we think we're going to achieve it. I think the best sprint planning meetings contain those elements, so that all of the people in the team doing the work have been privy to those conversations together as a team to be able to make that sprint successful, so that you're not halfway in a sprint and one developer says to another, I'm not really sure why we put these tasks here. I don't understand the logic. Why didn't we do it like this? If everybody's all together in the sprint planning meeting, they are fully cognizant of why they're doing something and what the logic was behind that decision. There's no relative estimation. So not only do you have just sprints to sprints that don't have consistency in them, but even potentially story to story within that sprint. So setting up relative estimation scales, setting up planning poker well, another reason why sprints don't go well. And stories are too big. So again, the thinking hasn't gone behind that story, the refinement hasn't been there, there's not been enough logic behind those stories, and hence they're too big. So I did put any more for any more, but we're doing questions at the end, but I'm sure you can all think of many more reasons why sprints don't go to plan, and why also sprint planning doesn't go to plan. So I'll just leave that one there for now. But again, it's just the emphasis on why this meeting is so important. So we need to make sprint planning more palatable, because we all know from our Scrum textbooks that sprint planning should be 8 hours for a 1 month sprint and proportionately less for shorter sprints. However, that means that a 2 week sprint, which I think is a reasonably perfectly acceptable sprint duration, still means that we need 4 hours every 2 weeks to try and come up with all of these ideas, thoughts and solutions in those 4 hours. And for me, that's too long. That is such a long period of time. And especially when you're working remotely and you're looking at a screen, it's not even like you've got snacks, you can't have it to be that long, okay? So let me now explain the benefits to what this meeting called story time is, okay? So story time should be held a day or so before sprint planning. So bear that in mind when we're going through these benefits. We focus, as I said, only on the next sprint. We don't think any further ahead. We just think about what's coming up next, okay? Because that keeps the team focused on what's coming up just one sprint ahead, rather than a couple of sprints time, which might distract them from the solutions that they may put in place in the next sprint. So we want just enough work for the next sprint. We want to make sprint planning shorter, and putting this meeting in prior to sprint planning clears up a lot of issues, so that it means that we're not having to do all that thinking on the day. It means there's no surprises happening on the day of sprint planning, okay? So we want to make that meeting shorter and more succinct. It's an opportunity for the Scrum team, as in the product owner, Scrum Master and Scrum development team, to go through the candidate stories for the next sprint, okay, and feedback on them. So up until sprint planning has concluded, stories are always just candidates, okay? They are not commitments until the closure of sprint planning. So until that point, we call them candidates, because we need to get some feedback on whether those stories are sprint fit enough or meet the definition of ready. Okay, the team get a say in what's possible before it's too late, and the PO can set expectations elsewhere. So the amount of times that I've been in sprint planning and there has been surprises and the team have said no way, yet the product owner has made commitments on behalf of the team prior to that meeting, it's unacceptable. So this way, the team get a heads up on what is expected in the stories of the next sprint, and they actually get the opportunity to feed back and say, that story's too big, that story can merge with this story, this story's acceptance criteria needs tweaking, the scope creep in that. You know, they have the opportunity to negotiate that story with the product owner, because we all know the N in invest stands for negotiate, and this is part of that promise, that they get to negotiate what that story looks like and how it could possibly be done in the next sprint, as in, is it of the right size? Is it clear? Do they understand? So the PO therefore has time to get the stories sprint fit just in time. Okay, so hence we have this meeting a day or so before sprint planning, so that gives the product owner plenty of time to make any amendments to those stories that was discussed in story time in good enough time, not only to make those amendments, but also an opportunity to reset expectations outside of the direct Scrum team. Okay, so this is how to set up story time for success. Okay, there's two elements of it. There's prepare and then you do the meeting. So we all know as good girls and scouts that failing to prepare is preparing to fail. So you need to get the PO in a great place. That's the main element of this meeting. You know, so that means great stories are written, the prioritization of the backlog is there, and the PO being clear on the vision is absolutely key. So as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, we can work with the product owner however we can to make sure we're spending enough time with the product owner prior to story time to make sure that those stories are in the best possible place. And it might mean, you know, if they need to write 10 stories within that sprint, an Agile coach or Scrum Master could dedicate, say, 10, 15, 20 minutes a day with that product owner to write just 2 stories a day. You can get through just 2 stories a day, right? So let's commit to that. Or they might decide to have a meeting purely for story writing so that product owner feels confident that they're actually being able to have a clear execution of those stories in story time and also answer questions in sprint planning. So you get your PO in a good place with their stories, making sure they're meeting best criteria, making sure they have good acceptance criteria. My personal rule of thumb is 3 to 5 acceptance criteria per story to make sure that they're not too big. They meet the definition of ready, and the syntax is great as well, because I am a stickler on syntax. Anybody who's worked with me in the past knows that I absolutely need the syntax to be spot on, so it's directive enough but not prescriptive. You need to tell the business that the deadline for getting stories is the day before story time. So you as an Agile coach or Scrum Master, or even as a PO, if you need to get requirements from outside of your Scrum team, you need to make sure that they bring those to you the day before story time, so you've got enough time to finish off those stories that you've been writing. Then the PO has all the candidate stories that are sprint fit as they possibly can make them, so they've done their absolute best to make those stories absolutely spot on, ready for sprint planning. So a little bit of a tip is in Jira, if you set up a new sprint, every sprint that's called candidate stories, then you can put your refined, ready to go stories in that bit of Jira. And then when it comes to sprint planning, you change the name to whatever the name of your sprint is. I also recommend that you have a few, what I like to call Brucey bonus stories, so that it means that if you get through all of those stories miraculously in your sprint, you've already had that discussion with the team about some possibilities should they be able to go in. Okay, so again, you're setting your team up for success, making sure they're all prepared. So next is the meeting itself. So first of all, you need to have it a day or so before sprint planning, as I've mentioned, to give the product owner time to make the amendments that they need to make to any stories that are necessary. And then you follow the agenda, which for me is, okay, you as a Scrum Master or as an Agile coach, you read through each story, all the story and the acceptance criteria, or you say to your team, here's 2 minutes of silent reading. It's very important that it's silent because you don't want anybody to distract anybody else through that very important time of processing those requirements, because up until this point, it's likely that the team haven't even seen those stories before, and that's not a bad thing. So you give them 2 minutes, say, and you set the alarm and off they go for 2 minutes in silence. Then you say, does anybody need any more time? If the answer is yes, you give them more time. If the answer is no, you move on and you say, are there any questions on this story? They discuss, they clarify, and they give feedback. Once that's done, the final question is, can we get through the story in the next sprint? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, you go on to the next story and repeat the process. If the answer is no, you continue with the discussion, and you may need to split the story, and that's something that the PO can do. Remember, between now and sprint planning, they've got that buffer time to do that. And if the answer is yes, you just keep going until you gut feel you've got enough in the sprint. So don't forget, these are just candidates, not commitments, you keep going until the team gut feel that they've got enough. Okay, so that's the agenda. Everybody needs to attend, so the whole Scrum team, the PO, the Scrum Master, and the Scrum Development team. And you aim for about an hour. So you might have to start with more than an hour to begin with, and you have to be very prescriptive at the start. You need to stick to this agenda and do it like an absolute machine every single time. But in time, people will get so much better at this and so much faster. And I've ended up with story time meetings for 2-week sprints that last literally half an hour. Okay, so it does get better in time, but you've got to get the practice in at the beginning. Following that, the PO then takes away their actions to update any stories if necessary, and they're ready to go for sprint planning. So sprint planning is therefore set up for success with the best possible candidate stories that he or she can write in time. So setting each other up for success is really hard. And again, it's about thinking ahead about what does each person on this team need. So as a Scrum Master and Agile coach, that's where you can come in and really add value. So by implementing this meeting, it's just one way of being able to fix those problems, because if your sprint planning is wrong, it's very telling about the culture and state of an organization. So you can also start to work on those organizational impediments to make sprint planning work and to make story time work. Okay, so it's about setting up your meetings in good enough time with the stakeholders that you need to involve in order to get the information you need for those stories to be good and for those story time meetings to be right and sprint planning to be right. It all has a follow-on effect, as I'm sure you're all aware, and you may need to raise organizational impediments in the process, but the key objective is to make sure that sprint planning goes well, because we know that if sprint planning goes well, the sprint will go well, and if the sprint will go well, the delivery will go well, you'll get more trust and confidence in the Scrum process, which will in turn inspire your leadership to make organizational changes, which will further allow the provision of Scrum throughout your organization. Okay, cheers. Let's do this. I hope you enjoyed my talk on story time, and I'm looking forward to questions at the end. Thank you.
Amy, thank you very much. I thought that was an excellent talk. I believe we have Stuart with us now. Had a bit of a technical issues to start off, but Stuart, have we got you with us now?
Yes, we do. We do. As you know, my pulse rate went above 200 there, as I couldn't get in, and I've had to rebuild my slides. So, but we're good to go. We are good to go.
Perfect. So your audio sounds good. Do you want to just share your screen? There we go. Yeah, that looks good. I will pass over to you.
All right. So, title of my talk is Fragile, and it's on the back of a new book that's just been published, and it's really about how to make your Agile project work and deliver. And if I go back to my experience with Agile, I started with Agile as a consultant 18 years ago. And I know what you're thinking, no way, Stuart, surely you look younger than Amy. You're right, I do. Amy and I work together, and yes, I do look a lot younger than her, despite what she says. And if I go back to when I started with this was how we were working back in the day. And my first project was, I was working in a system in the public sector called Housing Voids. And what we had to do was we had to help the client refurbish what was social housing and get them back into the market. And every single time that we didn't get a house back into the market, they were losing rental income. And at the time, I genuinely didn't know how to solve this problem. And I was very fortunate because I came across at the time Ellie Goldratt, and I did some work with Ellie Goldratt and Ellie Goldratt's team. And what they talked about then and what they taught me then really is the thing that is I'm going to talk about today, and so important in projects, is task management and reducing multitasking. And what we saw at the time was we saw lots and lots of these social houses all being worked on at the same time. and a situation therefore lots of houses being launched and weeks and months when actually all of those houses would be delivered all at the same time. Now, if we look at the time, what was the housing manager most interested in? Well, they were most interested in how do we keep our people busy? Not how do we keep the right resource busy? How do we make sure we're working on the right thing at the right time? But how do we keep our people busy? And when it would come to the end of the week, when we'd say, how many houses have been released this week? The answer was not many. And why was that? Because they're saying, well, it doesn't make sense because everybody has been busy. So if we think about the analogy is we all have on our desk probably a giant to-do list. And we all have things on that to-do list that we know have been on there for a while, but actually we haven't tackled yet. Now, as part of my career, one of the things that I did is I taught the David Allen methodology, getting things done, for a few years. And one of the things that we had to do be able to teach that course was to really do the research on how does the brain work when it looks at a task. And the brain asks 3 questions. Question number 1 is, have I done this task before? Number 2, is this task going to be difficult? Number 3, is this task going to take me time? And if the answer is we haven't done it before, yes, it's going to be difficult, and yes, it's going to take time, then what happens is the brain tends to help us find something else to do, which is why, and you might have seen it even more frequently working from home, is that when you look at your to-do list and you're sitting in the house and you say, that's the next thing that I need to do, you find yourself instead doing something like cleaning, doing the ironing, washing the car, because you still want to have this sense of being busy, but you're not actually working on the right thing at the right time. So the key back in the day was using visual measures and visual management to make sure that we were working on the right thing at the right time. Now, what we weren't bright enough to do at the time was to recognize that Agile, Kanban would come out of a lot of the work that Ellie Goldratt was doing in terms of theory of constraints. We didn't know at the time that we were doing stuff like Kanban, but it was the very, very early version of that. So if you go forward to today, what are we doing today to try and solve the problems of delivery? Well, the first thing that we do with all our project teams is that all projects start with a PERT diagram. Now, no big deal here, you say. But one of the challenges that we've seen in a lot of the project environments that I've studied over the years is that the BA typically does the project design or the Gantt chart or whatever it is. And they then go around everybody and say, does this look right to you? Now, you might have read a book called The Wisdom of the Crowd by a guy called James Sirowecki. And what he says is that the more people we have involved in the design of whatever we're doing, the greater the chance we have of getting that thing right. So what we started doing, first of all, in terms of doing PERT diagrams, whether it was for a full project, whether it was an agile project, and we're just doing MVPs, was making sure that we had everyone involved. The second thing we then did, and Amy's talked about this a little bit, is making sure that actually we were using plain language. In one of my previous roles, I was head product owner, head of digital projects at Zurich, Ireland. And one of the challenges we had there was the language that the engineers were using, people just simply couldn't understand it. So we made sure that everybody used plain language in terms of what does done look like. And the convention became that we had to make sure that we'd be able to describe in concrete terms, what do we see in front of us? What would we see physically once the thing was done? So having everybody involved, making sure that we had the same language, making sure that before we left any stand-ups, that everybody's clear on what the next action was, meant that we benefited from, and the terminology that myself and my colleague Alana, who's on the call, Alana Bushnell, uses, is that we have the wisdom of the crowd, not the wisdom of the loud. In other words, rather than the person that speaks the loudest, we make sure that everybody is involved in the building of the network diagram. Now, the other thing that we have done, and I know that some of you won't agree with me on this, and some of you will say that I'm wrong, is that Alana and I have studied lots and lots of Agile projects in terms of story points, where the story points were completely different. And we put those into a control chart to see how long they took. And what we found was that irrespective of the time or the size or the number of story points, is everything actually took the same time. So what we started to do was we started to experiment with rough estimates. And what we wanted to avoid is we wanted to avoid a hard due date, because we know that if we do that, we build in student syndrome, which is, nobody does anything until near the time, or Parkinson's law, which is the work expands to fit the time. So we moved to rough estimation, knowing that if we had everybody involved, our estimations would be there or thereabouts. And we built a leadership program to work with the leaders to tell them how to behave to support how the projects needed to be delivered. In other words, that if we had a rough estimate of, let's say, 20 to 25 days, then if we didn't do it in 20 or 21 or 22 days, the leader was not to come along and say, why was that not delivered? Because we wanted to benefit from the law of aggregation, that some would finish early, some would finish late, and as such, we would deliver overall on time or early. In other words, if you have a hard due date, unfortunately what happens is you will at best deliver on time, but mostly deliver late. So we wanted to avoid that, and we wanted to make sure that we could still do this with things like MVPs. So we moved to rough estimation rather than story points. And what we do every single day is when the people are doing their updates at the end of the day, we have a situation where the question that we ask them is not, what is the percentage complete of your story, or how many story points remaining, is we ask a very simple question, what's the remaining duration? Now what happens is, every day the remaining duration, we've built a little program that works in Jira, and every day the remaining duration goes from the story up to our epic board. So it goes storyboard, epic board, then goes up to our PERT diagram. And what that builds every single day is it builds a favor chart or a buffer management chart. And that tells us every single day, again, whether it's an MVP or whether it's an entire project, whether or not we're running early or whether or not we're running late, and allows us to know early if we are actually going to be running late. The next key is to make sure that in terms of our Jira storyboard, is that we only have the stories visible that people are actually working on. Now, the big challenge that we've seen across all our projects, coming back to where I started, which is task management, is people working on the wrong task at the wrong time. Going back to this thing I talked about with David Allen's methodology in getting things done, is we need to make sure that even if somebody hasn't done the task before, or even if they think that task is going to be difficult, that if that's the next task, that's what they must work on. And what we've done is we've built a number of network diagrams that show how people are working currently. And again, what you see is people working on lots of different epics, lots of different stories, not working on those in the correct order. And we launched a new piece of work with a team last week. Day one, we were very, very clear on what things they should be working on. At the end of the day, we were clear on, you were the constrained resource, so you were the ones that had to be working all day. At the end of the day, we said to them, did you get your task done? And they said, no, somebody else asked us to work on something else. So again, even though we were clear on the rules, the big problem that we have solved is working on the right task at the right time through all of these different systems and having them all integrate together. What does that mean? Well, that means that the projects that we have applied this thinking and methodology to, and with Alana's leadership program supporting all of this, what we've seen in one of our divisions is we've seen a 66% reduction in cycle time to deliver stories. We've seen a 50% reduction in cost to deliver stories and epics and projects. We've seen morale increase by 40% because we've eliminated all of the distractions, just working on the right thing at the right time. We saw a major phone-based application, which was due to deliver actually next March, was delivered this year on the 26th of June. And the project that we started working on 10 days ago, which was due to deliver mid-September, actually delivered last Friday. So again, to summarize, the things that we started working on 18 years ago, which was task management, working on the right things at the right time, really that thinking hasn't changed. All we've been able to do now is integrate through tools like Jira, fever management, buffer charts, PERT diagrams, hardwiring all of that into a much more complex environment, so that the key thing is having each engineer work on the right thing at the right time, which means that at the end of the day, what's happened is projects are now being delivered 66% faster than they were before. Thank you very much. Alex, back to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Sorry, I was just plugging my headphones back in there. So, yes, I've had some questions come in, which is great. And feel free, everyone, to keep bringing your questions, keep firing your questions into me. Just put them into the chat privately at the bottom. And as I said before, I will ask them to our speakers. So we'll start straight away. Darryl, one has come in for you. How can you measure values as outcome without output in some form? For example, new functionality or working software, etc.
So, sorry, just to be clear. So, can you just repeat the question for me, sorry, Alex, just so I'm clear.
Of course. How can you measure values as outcome without output in some form?
Okay. So look, I think for me, the value piece is an interesting sort of point, and that's what I sort of tried to, not to be too prescriptive about that this evening. I think that if you're looking at outputs, I always think of outputs as being the number of stories or the number of tasks that are getting done. So you obviously need to produce something to measure value. There's no doubt about that. If you're not releasing anything or you're not producing anything, then there's no value, full stop. But what I would say is it's understanding what that value means to you as your business. So, is your business, if it is just financial, then absolutely, the outcome is the value sort of you get out of it from a financial perspective. But it's not always, financial. It could be, the outcome is that you want to, it could be a defensive outcome in the sense of you want to reduce the number of people that are calling into a call center because they can actually serve themselves on a website. So I think it's finding that balance and understanding what value really means to the different business and what the purpose of that value is that's important.
Thank you very much. To Amy, some teams build software which aren't customer focused. Rather, the software are internal infrastructure focused, enabling other teams to build on top. The requirements are set by executives whose time are limited. Who should play the role of product owner? It's also worth mentioning that executives might not attend all sprint planning.
Well, there's two things there. First of all, is the problem about what you mean by executive not attending sprint planning. That is an organizational impediment. That is a cultural issue, and that is what is inhibiting the correct implementation of Scrum at the organization. So for sprint planning to go well, or even story time to go well, the person who has written the stories and who is responsible for the requirements must attend that meeting. Okay, otherwise, how can you set up the team for success if you're not clear as the person with the vision for those requirements? Okay, so that's what I'd say to that. So if you've got problems in your organization with the attendance of the person who wants whatever you're wanting the team to do attending, then that's something that needs tackling by the Agile coach or the Scrum Master. Okay, the first bit around the technical elements, I think I understand this, is that saying that this is almost like a component team that is a dependency on other teams, and how do they organize their backlog? So the same principle applies. You still need clear requirements. You might not write them necessarily as user stories, because technical user stories, in my opinion, don't necessarily have to follow the format of as I want to say that with clear acceptance criteria. However, they should still follow a format of very clear requirements. Now, the person that I think is responsible for technical stories or technical requirements should be the technical team themselves. One thing that I have done in a couple of organizations is extend the traditional story time meeting format to, instead of being something that the feature product owner would drive, I've had a technical story time meeting where I would say to the Scrum development team, i.e. the technical people in the Scrum team, to create a backlog of their own that is purely technical stories. Now, that could be stories that are maintenance stories. It could be stories that the team know needs to happen in order for other things to happen in the future. But either way, it's purely something that a non-technical person would not understand. And therefore, if they have a technical storytime meeting where they as teams act as collective product owners in that environment, you might have an engineering lead who might take the lead and be the product owner, but ultimately, as technical teams, they are responsible for managing a technical backlog themselves. And when it comes to, say, a feature story time where the non-technical product owner is responsible, you can then, as a technical team, say, well, we've had our own story time meeting and we've prioritized these items which we know need to go to the next sprint. Please can we incorporate them into the candidates so that we can then have a balance of new feature stories alongside technical stories that we know need to happen in this time. So the collective output is that you have a mixture and the correct balance of technical stories plus new feature stories, which should not only keep everyone happy in terms of the product owner understands the importance of these stories and they need to take place now, but it also chips away at a technical backlog, which we all know we have and ignore. We all know that technical stuff is getting done in a sprint, but we are, terrible at being able to keep that on the radar, and we just do it under the radar, which skews what our velocity is. So by having the extension of story time to a purely technical story time, where the team themselves, the technical team themselves, take ownership of that and prioritize that, you can then either feed them into the feature team story time, or you can have some way of having visibility of that. But I don't believe that a non-technical person should be responsible for technical stories. I hope that answers the question. If not, please do ask me to expand or elaborate in some way.
That would have to come from that was a lot more high level than my Agile knowledge. So if the questioner wants to reach out to Amy directly, please do so. I'd always encourage that as well. Stuart, question for yourself. If you're organised by product, why do you also use projects as delivery mechanism?
Don't see that it really makes any difference, to be honest with you, because you're still having to build stories and epics, so that doesn't make any difference at all. The methodology that we've been trialing in a number of different labs in the business is agnostic to project or products.
Okay, thank you very much. To Darryl, what are some good triggers and structures to do continuous mini inspect and adopt rather than just retros? I'll say it again. What are some good triggers and structures to do continuous mini inspect and adopt rather than just retros?
So I think retros obviously are, that they're there for that inspect and adapt. But I think for me, it's not necessarily triggers. It's having that mindset to have that conversation, to have that collaboration, and to be able to feel comfortable to feed back and to understand and talk to one another as a team and across teams. So I think, as I say, the retro is the key, but I'd encourage, feedback at any time, that discussion piece, that sort of, even, you have your daily scrum, then, after the daily scrum is finished, then why not that time? I don't think there's a trigger per se for me. I think it's literally, it's a mindset thing, and it's about trusting each other and understanding that actually, whatever the feedback, whatever that inspect and adapt is, it's not personal. It's very much to help the team and people improve. Does that answer the question, I think?
Again, the same to Amy. I can only hope. If you don't feel your question has been answered by our speakers here, do reach out to them. Amy, another question for you. What if the Scrum team defines the backlog rather than it being left to the product owner? The Scrum Guide says this is allowed.
I'm not 100% sure on whether the Scrum Guide says that is allowed, actually. There are 3 key roles in Scrum. There is a product owner, the Scrum Master, and the Scrum development team. And those roles and responsibilities are there for a reason. And that is because the product owner alone is the single riggable neck responsible for the requirements. The Scrum Master is obviously responsible for ensuring that the Scrum process is followed correctly to the best of the ability for the constraints of the organization at that time. And the Scrum development team is obviously responsible for the delivery with best engineering practices possible. And that tension is there for a reason. And we know that if the Scrum team, if it involves technical people, the likelihood is, and the risk of that is that they will gold plate requirements based on what they think, rather than actually what the business is driving for the value of that product. So like I mentioned before, I think if it's a technical backlog, then absolutely the technical people on the Scrum team can refine those and they can prioritize those. But if it's a new feature, then you need a product owner in place to be responsible for writing those stories, creating, maintaining the backlog, and being able to have a vision with that Scrum team. And if you don't have that in place in your organization, then again, that is an organizational impediment that the Agile coach or Scrum Master needs to be tackling to make sure that those 3 roles and those responsibilities of those roles are in place.
Thank you. Another one for you, Amy. What are your thoughts on job stories? I've seen a lot of teams labor over trying to turn a simple task into a user story.
On job stories, was that, sorry?
Yes, on job stories. So I'll say it again. What are your thoughts on job stories?
I'm not sure what a job story is, but I'm assuming it might mean like a task or maybe something like that. Can I bring
Nikki Bennett? Are you there?
Hi, I'm there. Hi. Yeah, it's a task. So, make a phone call, set up a meeting, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I work at RBS as a Scrum Master, and I see this quite a lot. There's a lot of deep thought trying to turn these things into user stories. So, just what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that the backlog contains user stories and not tasks. A backlog can also contain defects or bugs, but not tasks. Tasks are something that is attached to a user story in order for that user story to be fulfilled. So at sprint planning, I would argue that something that granular might not be necessary. However, I am also an advocate of prescription at the beginning of a Scrum implementation. And if you need that kind of detail to be included, then it can be included as a task if it is attached to that story. So your overall user story is written with acceptance criteria, and it's those acceptance criteria that get accepted or rejected by that product owner. But those tasks are all things that come into play in order for that story to be realized. Okay, so you can follow tasks down the Scrum board, you know, and if you need to make a phone call, need to do this, need to do the other, that's absolutely fine. Although I would technically say, though, if you're having to say in a task that you need to make a phone call throughout the sprint, then maybe the preparation hasn't been quite there and that story doesn't quite meet the definition of ready before it goes into the sprint. But yeah, that's my stance on job tasks. They should be tasks attached to a wider story.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you. Thanks for your answer there, Amy. And thanks for jumping in, Nikki. Stuart, how much flexibility do you provide with your process? To provide a little more context, you mentioned working on the next task, which is fixed. How much flexibility is provided for the next task?
What do you mean by flexibility? Meaning, if for any reason you cannot work on the next task, what do? Is that what you mean?
Okay, so Emmanuel Nonrom, have I got you there? Could you jump in and help with the question?
Well, it depends on the size of the task. So my question is, when working on a project, you've defined the next task, but there are some days where, as someone who is delivering that task, you just don't work on that task that day. You could work on it the next week if you wanted to, because you want variety. This happens a lot, whereby, let's say, software delivery developer wants to say, I'll pick up this task next week because I've been working on this project. How much flexibility would you provide?
So you're not going to like my answer. What we found in all of the projects that we studied, and certainly all the ones that I've studied over the years, is this is the number one reason why we're not delivering enough things. Because people are not working on the things in the order in which they should be working on them. So the majority of the time, what we're trying to do now is say, if that is the next task, we want you to work on that next task. So when somebody picks up that task, the question we're asking them is, can you finish this task? If not, you need to raise your hand and say, I can't finish it. The job of the leader then becomes unblocking. What we've found in a lot of cases when someone gets blocked is that they'll send an email and they'll say, I'm blocked, please try and unblock me. And they'll push that to the side and they'll work on something else. And again, consistently we've found working on the wrong thing at the wrong time is what is stopping product delivery. It's what is stopping fast, frequent, iterative things being delivered. So where possible, we try to avoid people not working on the wrong thing at the wrong time. Hence, we try and make sure they can work on the next task.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. Darryl, my team used pair programming pre-lockdown. However, pair programming while working remotely has been very difficult. Long-running video calls during pairing seems to lead to cognitive load. Any recommendation on how to approach pair programming remotely while being agile?
So, I think it's obviously everyone seems to be getting Zoom fatigue at the moment. It's not really surprising. Obviously, you know, everything is being remote. What I've seen with the teams that I've seen that have been successful doing pair programming remote is being quite clear about setting the boundaries and setting the expectations up front. So, you know, we're recommending that the teams have have a sort of team charter and ways of working that they're comfortable with, and they sort of stick to that. And you know, going back to the principle about inspecting and adapting, then sort of bringing it up and making sure that actually within the retro or at any time that if they're not comfortable with it, then they change it. So we've seen, it being time boxed, so sort of half an hour periods that are strict on half an hour as well. It doesn't sort of drift on to 45 minutes to an hour because, if any longer than that, then you lose focus and, it's not as great. So that's definitely worked, and mixing it up definitely as far as sort of who they're working with from a learning perspective and collaboration perspective. Then also having the right tools, making sure that you've got the right tools, the right whiteboards, that collaborative sort of tools to be able to allow you to do it, and continuously having that conversation. So, make sure your mic's on, your camera's on as well, you're sharing screens, and you're using it as if you are, pair programming in next to each other. It's not obviously straightforward, and bearing in mind that, often there is other meetings or other events that people sort of need to go on. It can become quite, wearing. But I think by reducing it down and being very time boxed and strict with that time boxing, has seen that the teams that I'm working with have still managed to do it and be sort of successful with doing it.
Thank you very much. And a question has come in for all three of you. So Amy, if you answer first, as you've not spoken for a short while, how do you think this pandemic will affect agile ways of working within organisations? So Amy, you go first. Let's sort of keep our answers. Let's time box this to 60 seconds per person, because it's the question has gone to all three of you.
I think it will affect the amount of physical face-to-face time we get. And I think it will affect how we utilise the real estate that we have. So Lloyds Banking obviously has huge amounts of real estate, and it's obviously a very expensive asset for the organisation to retain if we have proven throughout this pandemic that we can actually still function as an organisation without it. So I expect, potential for activities to be office-based, but very sparsely so. Unlike, day-to-day office-based work, it may be that we might just go in for maybe sprint planning or something like that. There's nothing been made or even really discussed at length about post-COVID implications at the bank as yet. So I don't want anybody to think that this is a public broadcast of how Lloyds Bank are going to operate post-COVID. This is just my personal opinion, and I think we will spend a lot more time collaborating using our video conferencing tools that we have now, more virtual whiteboards, virtual project management tools like Jira, etc., etc. I think what's important to retain, though, if we continue to work virtually for most of our time, is to still adhere to those agile principles, which is the best form of communication is face-to-face. It's also the fastest form of communication. So just for people to be mindful that, yes, it's great to use Slack, it's great to use messengers and things like that, but the fastest form of communication will still be to use your video application, whatever tool you're using, to get your answer faster.
Thank you. And Stuart, you want to jump in?
Sure. My view is that the problem to be solved pre-COVID is still the same problem, is that people are working on the wrong things at the wrong time. So therefore, the problem to be solved is still the same: task management. I believe that what COVID has done is it's made collaboration, and will continue to make collaboration more difficult. There's nothing like, as everybody knows, being in the same room, collaborating on the building of the thing that we're going to deliver, whether it's an MVP or whether it's a project. But I still believe that actually the problem to be solved is not actually a being in the same room one. It's how do we get better at working on the right thing at the right time.
Thank you. And Darryl?
No, I think definitely, it will definitely, as mentioned by Amy, that teams will have to change and have to adapt accordingly, and it won't be as much face-to-face. So it will definitely be using the tools that are out there and have been so vital over the last few months. I think it'll be really sort of, how it affects agile ways of working. I think for me, it is still going back to those principles and that manifesto, and having that mindset and understanding what that means. I think that we don't know what's going to happen, really. This is the thing. It's a bit unknown at the moment. We can only make assumptions. So it's hard to predict with any certainty, but I think that, teams and, you know, that outcome-driven approach that I mentioned will be even more important, I think. So we'll see, I guess.
Thank you very much. And that actually brings us to the end of our questions for this week. And absolutely massive thank you to Darryl, Amy and Stuart for your sort of contributions on Agile London and to the Agile community this evening. 3 fantastic talks, and all 3 of you sort of drew some great questions from our audience. Thank you to everyone for joining us as well. These events wouldn't happen without you all speaking, and with you all sort of getting involved, participating, asking questions, and really sort of, again, getting involved in the Agile community. If you are looking for work, or if you are looking to hire, my name is not Oliver Bernard. I'm signed in via our company account. My name is Alex Scriven. You can find me really easily on LinkedIn. I've got some amazing candidates looking at the moment if you're trying to find talent. And we are starting to see a little bit of an improvement with some requirements coming out from our clients. It's nowhere near as what it was, but there are signs of improvement. So do reach out and I'll connect you to our relevant teams within the business. Once again, Darryl, Amy and Stuart, thank you very much. We are back next week, and actually today I've had one of my speakers unfortunately drop out. So if anybody on this group now would like an opportunity to speak at Agile London, I've had a slot come available for next Wednesday. I will be reaching out to some of my network, but if you'd like to speak, raise your hand or forever hold your peace. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope to see you all online next week. See you later.
Very much. Cheers. Bye.